Okay, we're recording. All right, well, thanks to the both of you for joining. Like I said, hopefully some more people will trickle in. If not, that's okay. It'll be just two of us. There were about 10 people total who had signed up through Slack, but not everybody confirmed. So anyway, we'll just go with what we got. So we wanted to talk about Python requests and making your code smaller, shorter, easier to read, execute faster, et cetera, et cetera. There's a bunch of tips that I've posted over the years on the Okta Slack channel. So this is sort of just a summary of those. You know, if anyone's read those tips before, this will kind of be a review, although obviously we can, you know, this is interactive. You can ask questions. Hopefully you saw my note about bringing your own code if you want to share it with me. Just snippets of it. I don't want to see 500 lines of code if we wouldn't have the time for it. But if you have at least just a little bit of a skeleton of maybe certain things that you find tricky or find interesting, that would be good to share as well. So if you haven't had a chance to do that, maybe you can do that while we get started here. And I see also Rob has joined. Rob, you're on mute, but can you hear us?
Sure can.
All right. Hey, I like that accent. And is it IP or LP? I can't tell.
Yes, LP. I'm here as well.
Hey, LP, how are you? All right. Well, great. So yeah, at any time, if you you can just take yourself off mute, or there's probably a raise hand button or something like that. You can just sort of cut in. You know, I don't have a whole lot of like fixed presentation, but I am going to review my notes here, the things that I said I would talk about during this call. And again, we can just kind of leave it open-ended as well and make it interactive. So we talked about using either the requests module in Python or the Python SDK. There are other ways to make HTTP calls from Python code. Is anyone using, like, let's start with requests. Who is using requests here or has used requests or is interested in using requests?
I use request, yeah.
Okay, I see some hands up and I see one person. Okay, yeah, you can use the, where is that? Oh, there's a reaction menu at the bottom, I think, where you can react. Yep. I see that like there's a hands up or a thumbs up or something. How about clear it then. I haven't used Zoom in a while. How about the SDK, the official Okta Python SDK? Has anybody tried that? Anybody interested in that? Okay, Rob has. I know, Rob, we've talked about that before. The SDK, by the way, if you decide to go read about it, you know, maybe after this class, not during the class, but after class. There was an announcement made, I think in September, so 6 or so months ago, that they're gonna completely rewrite it. So if you haven't started learning it, I don't know how different it's gonna be in its new incarnation. And I haven't really heard any updates in 6 months, so I'm not sure what's gonna happen, but just keep that in mind. And what about other than Python SDK? By the way, the Python SDK uses asynchronous requests, so you have to use the async and await keywords everywhere. It's a little bit of a pain, but once you get used to it, it's not that much harder. And then you can actually get some really interesting performance gains by doing, you know, multiple requests simultaneously in parallel in essence. So let's say you wanted to fetch all your users and you're going to paginate through those. Typically, you paginate one page at a time. We're going to talk about that if you're not sure what I'm talking about. But if you want to fetch the factors, let's say for those users or the groups or the apps or whatever, you can actually do some of those in parallel, and it'll greatly speed up the performance of your script. Now, if you only have 100 users or a couple hundred users, it's probably not that big of a deal, and it may not be worth the effort to do all that. But if you have thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions, then yeah, writing some extra code to speed that up, you'll definitely see the performance gains. So anybody using anything other than requests or the SDK? Okay, sounds like no. So there are other modules, like there's one called HTTPX. There's another one called AIO HTTP. There's another one and another one and another one. There's probably I don't even know, 5, 10 or more modules, but request is kind of the go-to. Everyone seems to at least start off with that and maybe stay with it depending on what's necessary, what your requirements are. So let's see, we talked about, did anyone bring, by the way, code, or is anyone interested in sharing their code either now or later, or nope. Okay. Sounds good. So anyway, we talked about, we'll talk about pagination, which I think is kind of a big deal, making one simple call to one simple API. It's relatively simple, and it's kind of covered by the Okta documentation. Pagination stuff really isn't. And then you get into the issue of rate limits. If you make too many calls, whether to paginate or let's say to import users or whatever, you can get rate limit errors. So we can talk about how to reduce those errors. One of the standard things that I think is, makes Python easier to use is to, let's say, reading or writing CSVs, whether you're importing data into Okta or exporting it out of Okta. Using CSV is kind of a nice thing to do. We talked about creating a session for performance reasons. And then one more thing, which is kind of unrelated, but I think it's sort of an extra nice to have, is talking about Python naming conventions. So, I've seen a lot of people's code over the years. People have either posted it on the public Slack channel, or sometimes they'll DM me, and I see kind of code that's, all over the place, which is fine. Everyone is a beginner at some point. I was a beginner once. I started programming when I was 13. So I've been doing it for 40 some odd years now. But I was a beginner Python programmer. I started, I think, 5, 6 years ago, something like that, which means I didn't know anything. And, I'm the kind of person I really like to read manuals and kind of really dig deep into stuff. Some people just want to get stuff working, and that's what they have time to do, and that's great. So I'm not here to judge, but just offer, suggestions, recommendations for ways that you can make your code more readable, more shareable. I'd love to see more people share their code on the Okta channel as well. Maybe as a result of this class, people will. So let's get actually started. Enough talk. Let's actually start looking at some code. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Screen 2. All right. You all see my screen?
Yeah.
Cool. So this is sort of the what I call the the hello world of using the Okta API to, using Python to call the Okta API. Hello world just means the very basic program that you would write, the kind of the shortest program that does something interesting, something useful, shows you that your code, that your Python environment is working correctly, that your token is valid and hasn't expired, that you've got kind of the basics on there. And once you've got the basics, then you can build on top of it. So I call this one Pi 100. Maybe what I'll do is I'll kind of build on it, and I'll have separate versions of it as we go on to make this code better and better. And then again, you can kind of follow along with that. So what I'm doing is obviously I'm importing the request module. I'm also importing the OS module so I can read these environment variables. So I've actually stored the org URL and the token using these variable names. And I picked these because it's the same thing that the Python SDK uses, if I remember correctly. So I can actually interoperate with those, or I got them somewhere, I don't remember where, but I think that was the reason why. And then what you want to do is take that token and you put it into a header, which is called authorization. You put SSWS in front of it, and then that header gets passed into the request.get command. I'm taking the org URL, which is here, and I'm appending the API v1 users me. And when I call that, I get a response object back, and I can also check if it's okay or not. I can say if response not okay, do this, and if not, I can print an error. And I can actually print what the error is, but just for now, that's good enough. So if I run it, and you'll see the results over here, just hit F5, it's launching it, takes a few seconds, and there it is. So my title, I'm just printing my profile title. My title is admin. So this proves that I can connect to the API, that I did everything else correctly. Obviously, if I typed in an invalid username, I would get error. And again, I can even print what the error is. We have to do this or something, and it should give us an indication. Oh, interesting. Let's do this. Yeah, not found, resource not found, ASTL FJK, which is this stuff. It wasn't able to find it, so I get a resource not found error. So again, this is kind of just a very basic thing that just gets a user and prints it out. Any questions on this? And if not, I'll continue.
Nope.
Okay, great. So what can we do to make this code, better, cleaner, shorter, faster? Again, obviously for something simple like this, where there's probably not much we can do in terms of performance improvement, but there are some other goals, like I said, shorter, easier to read, more standard, stuff like that. By the way, I'm using VS Code, and I'm on Windows, but that shouldn't matter too much whether you're on Windows or Mac in terms of Python and VS Code. Are folks using VS Code? Are they using other editors or environments? What's the consensus out there?
VS Code on Mac.
Okay. And I did get a comment from Rob saying that those environment variables are used by the Python SDK. Yeah, I think that, like I said, I believe that was my initial motivation, but it's been a while since I set it up, so I don't remember anymore. But yeah, that sounds about right. Okay. So one of the cool things about VS Code on Mac or PC, doesn't matter, is if you hover over a function here and you hold down the control key, I don't know if it's the same on Mac, but on Windows it's the control key, you'll notice it turns into a little hyperlink. It turns blue and you get a little underline there. I can do the same thing here with the requests. So if I click on it, it actually goes into the code. And again, this is one of the things I didn't do 5 years ago when I first started learning Python and first started learning requests. I didn't read the code, but eventually I was curious, or I found a bug, or I was wondering how things were implemented. So this is a really cool way where you can actually start to read some of the code that you're using. Now, again, one of the beautiful things about using request.get or Python requests is you don't have to understand what's under the cover. You can just use it. You can just read the documentation. You can find examples on Stack Overflow. You can ask ChatGPT. You can look at somebody else's code. But for the folks who are curious, like me, I think it's a really interesting thing. So if I look at request.get, we'll notice what it does is it calls yet another function. And again, if I'm pressing and releasing the control key. Did anybody know this, by the way? Is this something that's known or not known? Has anybody looked at built-in code other than your own before? Or?
I didn't know that.
Okay. Cool. So I've taught one person one thing. So that's I've done my job. So I'm going to look at requests. And what I want to get is there's a session. Okay, here we go. One of the first things it does, and again, you'll see one of the interesting things about requests, it's a fairly large module. I think it's like 4,000 lines of code or something like that, is it has a function that calls a function that calls a function that calls a function. You have to sometimes go down 3, 5, 8 levels, whatever, just before you get to the good stuff. Same thing with the Okta SDK. It's a couple thousand lines of code, and you will have, file upon file, function upon function. So it can be a little confusing, once you start digging into it. But again, ultimately, it's a very reporting thing. At least I find that to be the case. Really, the reason I'm showing you this, other than it's a cool feature, is I wanted to show that one of the first things it does is it creates a thing called session.session, and it uses that, and then it uses a session request. And if you remember from Slack, one of the things that we said we were going to talk about is using sessions for performance. So under the covers, request is using a session even if we don't. The difference is that if you use your code this way, it's going to create a session, call it, and then destroy it. And then if you make another call later, let's say, for example, I'm going to copy paste, which just for fun here. Now I want to get some other user, 00u something. It's going to make a second session and then destroy that when it's done, et cetera, et cetera. Or let's say we're doing this in a loop. I want to read 10 user IDs from a CSV, and then I want to fetch each of the users and just print their type or something like that. it's going to create 10 sessions and destroy 10 sessions. Well, what does that mean? A session is, I believe, both a TCP IP connection. It's an SSL connection, which means it has to do the SSL encryption handshake. And at multiple layers in the network stack. And I'm not a network expert, and I might be misrepresenting that slightly. But the long story short is, it's kind of like if you're calling back in the day, those of you who are old enough to remember, there was a telephone service called 411 where you could call 411 and ask them, hey, I want the number to the rest of the Chinese restaurant down the street. And they would say, okay, please hold. The number is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You would hang up and call the restaurant. Well, you could ask them for multiple numbers. You could say, give me the name for the Chinese restaurant, and in case they're close, also the Japanese restaurant down the street. I'm hungry, as you can tell. And you could do 2 requests within the same session, within the same phone call. The alternative, obviously, is to call 411 once, get a number, hang up, call 411 again, get another number, hang up, and that's exactly what request is doing for you. So if we use the session, which again, it's already creating a session for us, we can make multiple requests, and that's the reason why you get the performance increases. And again, hopefully we'll demonstrate that in a second. Does that make sense so far? I know I'm kind of talking crazy here, but any questions? Have I totally lost you guys? Okay, Ron says thumbs up. Okay, and I assume silence means you're either asleep or you understood what I said. Cool. Okay, so one of the ways that we can make this code better, and again, I'm gonna leave this version as this so we can see where we started and where we ended. What I'll do is I'll do this, copy paste, and I'll call this. You can copy paste, by the way, in case you didn't know that. I'll call this CMB2. So let's, first thing we want to do is create a session. So the way we do that is to say session equals requests dot session, and it's with an uppercase S. Classes typically are with uppercase letters. The compiler doesn't really care. Python doesn't really care. It's just a convention that we humans have established in order to convey meaning. And again, I can control click on this, and I can see that this is a request session. It provides cookie persistence, connection pooling. And again, connection pooling, I think, is the thing that we're using really, is that we can make multiple calls to the same endpoint without having to do the TCP IP and SSL, the teardown and setup and all that cool stuff. So we can create a session, and then first thing we want to do is say session. It has a headers variable, just like we were using here, and just like we were using here. And I can say session headers of authorization equals this. Okay. And then I no longer need this headers thing. And then instead of using request directly, I'm going to use my session. Oops, I do need a closing parenthesis though. So if I run this, it should run the same. You won't really notice a performance improvement because I'm only making one call. But now my code is a little shorter. And again, that was one of our stated goals, is to make the code a little shorter. So again, now if I copy paste this, I don't have to copy that headers equals headers everywhere. I do it once at the beginning, and then everywhere where I use the session, it's going to reuse that same header variable. And obviously, if you ever write scripts, and I don't know if you all do, again, you can raise your hand if you do, where maybe you're reading or writing from multiple Okta tenants. You're reading from preview and writing to production, or vice versa. Maybe you want to back something up, or you want to promote something from a lower environment to a higher environment. Then you would create 2 sessions, one for your let's say dev tenant, and then a second session for your production tenant, and you could read from one and write to the other, or write from one and read to the other. Does that make sense?
And will you also be demoing that too?
Sure. If we get a chance, yeah, I can do that as well. But I mean, that's the basic gist of it. We would get this. We would do this. So again, I'm going to just call them session 1 and session 2, which are awful variable names. Please use good variable names, guys. It really does help. Session 2, and then this will be token 2 and token 1. That's the basic gist of it. So without getting too much more in detail, And again, if we have time, I'll try to go back and visit that, but just undo all that stuff. Okay. So, so that's one way to make the code a little shorter. And again, it does make it faster, although we won't see it. Let's do some pagination, shall we? So for pagination, and I guess I'm going to do that here as well, again, just so we can kind of compare the runtimes. So has anyone done pagination with the Okta API? I see one, I see two. Okay, looks like some folks have. Okay, so let's just cover it real quick. When you make a call, I'm gonna just copy this, and again, we're back to Python 100, the original version. You can make a call to the user's API, and this will fetch one page worth of users. A user's page is 200 users. You can request fewer by saying question limit equals 100 or 10 or 1 or whatever. You can't go higher than 200 though. It'll, if you probably do 2000, it'll just change it back to 200 for you. And notice I'm putting my parameters here. You can also do something like this. You can put in the params variable. I know I've worked with some of you folks on that, so you can say something like this, limit 200. If you prefer that syntax, there's no right or wrong answer here. There's advantages and disadvantages to each one. The advantage of doing this is it'll do the URL escaping for you, which again, I know I've worked with some of you that if you don't do the escaping correctly, you'll get errors. But again, most of the time, that's not really necessary. It's a little bit of overkill. So just for the simplicity, I'm going to take that out. But again, if you need something like that, just put a pin in it and we can talk about that later. So I can say limit equals 2. That way I can actually see some pagination, and I'm going to use the filter. Search is actually recommended by Okta documentation using search equals instead of filter equals. But honestly, every time I've used it, I found that it's slower. You can try both in your tenant. Maybe you'll see different results than I'm seeing. And again, if you have any, experience with that you've done it before and you've seen whether it works faster or not, that's great. This test tenant that I'm using has 102,000 users, and again, they're just test users that I created for load testing purposes. So obviously, if you're not using nearly that many users, you won't see the performance issues. But you may not see the difference between search and filter. But anyway, I'm going to take search out and use filter. So I want to do profile. This is kind of, again, my hello world for pagination. Profile.last name equals quote go. And it's going to fetch only the first 2 users. And this will come back as a users thingamajigger. And I'm going to just say for user and users. I'm going to take this out for the time being and change it to that. Okay, does everyone understand what this code does? Any questions on it before I actually run it? Okay, good. So I should see the first 2 users. Again, errors. Oh, I deleted the bracket. Okay, let's go ahead and run it. And again, the result should be here on the right. So I see admin, and I see that it didn't work. 31 users limit profile equals down. I'm guessing I'm getting an error. Anyone see what the problem might be? Let's go ahead and just say, actually, since I'm live coding here, I may be messing something up. So users should have the error and then result in it. Let's go try this and see if we get something better. Admin, and then everyone users limit equals to filter equals. We'll call that last name equal do.
Because some of your users may not have titles, you're going to get a key error if the title is null, because the Okta API will emit the value in the response.
Okay.
So you'll need to use .get instead of grabbing index directly.
Okay. you're probably right. I'm just gonna go for login, because login, there we go. That was probably it, because of the changing to login, fix it. And just to sort of comment on what you were saying, if I change it to something like this, for example, this should fix it as well. Let's go ahead and test that. There you go. And but it looks like neither of them had titles. So thank you for that. That was a good catch. But again, just for simplicity's sake, and it probably makes more sense anyway to just make something that we know everybody has. There's no point in getting a bunch of nuns. That's no fun. Okay, so I'm going to switch it back to login. But yeah, thanks again for that catch. And again, you'll notice it only fetched the first 2 users. So the question is, how do I get the rest of them? I know I have 9 people with the last name Doe. How do I know this? Because I've written this code about 5,000 times, or run this code about 5,000 times over the years. So how do I get the rest of them? Well, there's a variable in the response called response.links that will actually show you the pagination links. So let's go ahead and print those, and then you can kind of see what's in there. And then based on that, we can figure out how to use that to do pagination. So if we look at response.links, you'll notice it has a self variable, which points to the page itself. This is the first page in essence. If we're looking at page 2, then it's pointing to page 2. It also has a next variable that has a URL that points to the second page. And this is how we get to the next page, basically. And the URL itself has this after equals, and then this is really kind of the user ID. It might have an extra 0 or an extra prefix or something like that. But the documentation, if you read the Okta documentation, it says just use the link header just as is. Don't try to create your own. Don't try to modify it. Don't try to understand it. It could change tomorrow. It could change at any time. So the recommendation is just to use as is, and don't do anything with it. So I'm going to just change this slightly just for fun, and just fetch the next one, which again may not always exist. So I should use .get, but for now I'll just use next URL. So let's try that one more time. Makes it a little bit simpler to read. Okay, and now I see the actual URL. So what it's telling me is if I fetch this page, I can get the next 2, and then it'll give me another link, and I can fetch the next 2, et cetera, et cetera. So what I want to do then, in order to do pagination, and I'm going to do this way, I'm going to say URL equals, and I'm going to start with this as my base URL. But what I can then do is just say URL equals this. And then I can put all this in a loop, and I can say something like while URL. This is kind of the canonical way I've done it in the past. Oops, I've done it in the past. There's potentially other ways to do it as well, but this I know works because I've done it before. And we will get an error eventually, but for now, let's just try it with this. So any questions on this before I run it? Does it kind of make sense what I've done so far, or are you all lost?
The while is for to loop through every page.
Exactly, yeah. So what I've done is just wrapped this little block of code, which we ran once. We're going to run it each time. And then eventually what this should do, and it won't do it right now, I will fix it in a second though, we'll get an error, is we'll fetch the next one, and the next one, the next one, and eventually it'll come back and say, there's no next, you're done. And you'll get a blank, and then when URL is blank, then it knows to exit the loop. By the way, the Zoom that I got, the meetings only run for 40 minutes, so it will end in about 10 minutes. So I'll try to rush through this. I can always maybe send up another one, but I do have to run in probably, 20, 30 minutes. So whatever we can't finish today, we'll maybe work on next time as well. So let's go ahead and run this. Like I said, we'll get a little further, but we'll also get some more errors. So let's see what happens. So I got 2 users and a link, and 2 users and a link, and a 2 users and a link, and then I got an error because there is no more next. And again, as whoever that person was, I'm sorry I didn't catch your name, whoever mentioned it earlier, might have been Rob, that said, check to make sure whether there is a next link, use basically use .get in order to make sure that there is one. And if there isn't one, what we can do is return an empty dictionary. And then we can do the same thing here. We can say get the URL instead of using the bracket. And if there isn't one, it defaults to none, uppercase. And since it's the default, I'm going to take it out. So if I change it to this, it should actually finish paginating all the way and I won't get any errors. Let's try it one more time. And by the way, while this is running, notice it's going ka-chunk, 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 ka-chunk. Okay, so this time I didn't get any errors. I got a none at the end and I got all 9 users. There's 2 here, 2 here, 2 here, 2 here, and then 1 at the last page. Okay, any questions on that? Does it feel like magic or does it feel like something that you're familiar with?
No questions.
Cool. Okay, so what I wanted to kind of just make a mental note was the performance, and I can add, you know, start time, end time. I can actually make a clock showing, you know, how long it's actually taking to run. But we can do that too, maybe if we have time. I'm going to take this code and now move it to my Python version 2. And instead of using requests, we're going to use the session, and we should see that the same code should work exactly. I have to take up the headers now, but it should run a little bit faster. So let's go ahead and run it. And let's see if we can kind of notice a performance difference. So again, maybe hard to tell with such a short number of users and such a short number of paginations, but I think maybe it ran just a bit faster. Again, you can try both of these on your tenant when we're done, or you can create a free dev tenant and just play around with test data if you don't want to slam your rate limits and stuff like that. But just kind of compare the two. And again, I am doing a limit equals 2, so I'm only fetching 2 at a time. But we should see a slight performance improvement just by using a session instead of using the requests. Okay, any questions on that? Does that sort of make sense?
When is the accept and like content type headers required?
In my experience, they're not required. Oh, that's actually a really good question. So if you read the Okta documentation, which again, I recommend everybody do this, there's an accept header and there's a content type header. They should probably go up here with my other headers. But what I found is the accept header isn't required by Okta, even though the documentation says it is. It doesn't hurt to add it if you want to go ahead and add it. It'll technically be more correct, but I've never had a problem with omitting it. The content type, on the other hand, if you are making a change and you're submitting content, you absolutely have to supply a content type. But the nice thing about the request module is if I'm doing something like this, session.post, let's say, to some URL, and I'm saying JSON equals, and I'm giving it some JSON that I created above, it'll actually add the content type header for you. Therefore, you don't need to supply it yourself. So yes, if you want to be absolutely correct and just make sure, or if you want your code to be really clear, you can go ahead and add that yourself. But since request does it for you, I just go ahead and omit it. And I'm kind of a minimalist to a fault. I love to take away, if you've ever seen my posts, I love to take any unnecessary code away. If I'm writing workflows, I like to take any unnecessary cards away and have my code be as short as possible. Sometimes that code becomes less readable, and readability is important, but I just love really short code. I really, really love it. So I won't be including those, but again, you can if you want to. Okay, that makes sense? Any questions on that? Cool. So now what I think, although we've only have 4 minutes left, what I think makes the most sense to do is we're going to be paginating different types of things along the way. Today we're paginating users. Tomorrow we might be paginating groups or apps or whatever. I might have to write a script for this, that, or the other. So wouldn't it be cool if I could write a little function that had all this code in it and I could just reuse it? And that's really kind of what I wanted to cover today. But again, we're sort of already out of time. So I'll just show you the code real quick. And again, if we end up doing another session, we can talk about it. So what I've created, I'm going to do kind of hyper mode here because we only have 4 minutes. I'm going to speed run through this. I've created a file called Okta requests.py. And again, the source code is on the Slack channel. I can send you a copy if you're interested. And it's doing some of these cool things that I think are interesting. I'm importing requests in OS, just like I was on these two. I'm taking the request session class, which again, we were using here. Request session is the same as this. Let me put these side by side so I have to keep flipping back and forth. Okay, so request.session is the same thing as this, but I'm making my own class, which I also call session. Now I call it Gabriel session or Weston session or Okta session or whatever, and those might actually be better names, but for stupidity or lack of knowledge, I just call it session. Hopefully that's not confusing to anybody. A class has can use a default function called init. Init is an initialization function. So when you create an object of this class, it's going to call this init function. And this init function, all class methods always use a self. You know, self. But I've also added two additional variables, which is the org URL and the token. Again, this should look really familiar. They're pretty much exactly like this. And they even have the same defaults. So I can overwrite it. I can pass a different org URL and a different token to it. If I pass nothing, then it'll read it out of the my environment variables. The first thing that my init does is it calls the super init. Super is the super class, which is request.session. So I'm creating a subclass. This subclass you could say is like a child of this class, and this is my parent class or my super class. So I want to initialize it, and then I'm going to store two additional things. I'm going to store the org URL because I'm going to use it later. In fact, if I highlight it, you can see I'm using it down here. And I'm also going ahead and setting up the headers just like I did here. So again, these kind of 3, 4, 5 lines take place of some of this stuff here. And then basically all I've done is I've overridden one of the built-in methods to say if somebody passes in a URL that doesn't start with HTTPS, in other words, it's not a full, something.okta.com sort of thing, then just go ahead and have it for you, and then just call the super method. Again, I'm going through this stuff super fast because we only have about a minute left. I'm doing also some overrides on this just to make it JSON because we don't really, for the most part, want anything other than JSON. And then I have a function here called getObjects, which you'll notice looks a lot like this. It does use the yield keyword, and I'm probably not going to be able to have time to explain it, but if you're curious, go ahead and take a look at the Python yield keyword. It's kind of like the return statement within a function, but it works a little bit differently. So now that I've created this this thing, I can actually call it, and I have some code to call it. Let's see, I have a little tester here called test Okta requests, and here it is. And notice what I do is I say session equals Okta request.session. So I'm importing Okta requests, and I say Okta request.session. That replaces this line. This line is no longer necessary because it's done by my Okta request module. And now I can do a paginate like this. I can say, API v1 users. I have my filter here, my limit here, very similar to what I was doing down here in terms of filter and limit. And I can just paginate like this. Now, isn't this code a little bit nicer? Yes, Tony, we can absolutely do that. We can review this later on the next session. So this code basically replaces all of this code. And why? There's no magic, right? All I've done is basically cut and paste some of this code and put it here. And that way, whenever I want to use it, it's now down to just a couple of lines. So hopefully, again, we didn't cover everything we wanted to today. Sorry, the